My parents begged me for a loan, not knowing I owned the bank they were borrowing from. Subscribe for more stories where the overlooked rise in justice finally prevails. The foreclosure notice lay crumpled on my mahogany desk, smoothed out but still bearing the creases from where my father had crushed it in his fist before sliding it across the conference table toward me. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he pushed the document forward, the same hands that had once pointed dismissively at my army uniform, calling it playing soldier when I'd enlisted at 18. "Sarah, we need your help," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man who had commanded respect in boardrooms across Chicago for 3 decades was now sitting in mine, hat literally in hand, begging his daughter for financial salvation. "The farm, everything we've built, it's all going to be gone in 30 days. I studied the notice from Cornerstone Financial Services, my own bank's letterhead staring back at me in crisp corporate blue. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents were about to lose their generational dairy farm to the very institution I had built from nothing after leaving the military 15 years ago. They had no idea, of course. To them, I was still Sarah Mitchell, the wayward daughter who had wasted her 20s in desert combat zones instead of settling down and making something respectable of herself. "Mom, Dad," I said carefully, setting the notice down and looking across at both of them. My mother, Margaret, sat rigidly in her chair, her silver hair pulled back in the same severe bun she'd worn since I was a child. Her lips were pressed into a thin line of barely contained desperation, the same expression she'd worn when the bank had first contacted them about their mounting debt 6 months ago. How did it get this bad? My father, Robert, ran his hand through his thinning gray hair, a gesture I remembered from countless arguments during my teenage years. Back then, he'd made that same motion when I'd told him I was enlisting instead of going to college, when I'd explained that the military would pay for my education and give me purpose. He'd called it running away from responsibility then. Now, 15 years later, he was sitting in my office asking for help. He didn't know I was uniquely positioned to provide. "The drought last summer killed half our corn crop," he began, his voice gaining strength as he shifted into problem-solving mode. "Then the equipment broke down, and we had to take out loans for repairs. The medical bills from your mother's surgery in February cleaned out our savings, and now—" He gestured helplessly at the foreclosure notice. "Cornerstone Financial won't extend our loan. They want the full amount by the end of the month, or they're taking everything." I leaned back in my leather chair, the same chair I'd purchased after Cornerstone's first billion-dollar year. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my downtown Chicago office, I could see the bustling streets 40 floors below, the city where I'd returned after my final deployment to Afghanistan. My parents had no idea that their youngest daughter, the one they'd written off as a military dreamer, now controlled one of the Midwest's most successful regional banks. "How much do you need?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I had personally reviewed their file 3 weeks ago when it had crossed my desk as part of the monthly foreclosure review. Robert and Margaret Mitchell of Mitchell Family Dairy. The names had stopped me cold when I'd seen them in the report. My own parents, facing financial ruin, completely unaware that their fate rested in the hands of the daughter they'd never believed in. 200,000, my mother said, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. Her voice cracked slightly on the amount. "We've tried every bank in the county, Sarah. Everyone says we're too high risk. That dairy farming is a dying industry. We even went to those online lenders, but their interest rates would bury us deeper." She paused, reaching into her purse for a tissue. "We know it's a lot to ask. We know we haven't always supported your choices." The understatement of the century. When I'd returned from my 3rd deployment with a Bronze Star and a plan to use my GI Bill benefits for business school, they'd barely acknowledged my service. When I'd graduated from Northwestern with my MBA and started working in financial services, they'd asked when I was going to find a real job and settle down. When I'd launched my own investment firm 5 years after leaving the Army, they'd politely change the subject at family gatherings. "You built something important with that farm," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Grandpa started it in 1962, right after he came back from Korea. 4 generations of Mitchells have worked that land." I could see the surprise in their eyes that I remembered, that I valued the family history they'd assumed I'd rejected when I chose military service over agricultural tradition. My father nodded slowly. "Your grandfather would roll over in his grave if he knew we were about to lose it to some corporate bank." The bitterness in his voice was sharp, directed at the faceless institution that held their future in its hands. If only he knew he was staring at the CEO of that very institution. "What exactly did Cornerstone Financial tell you when you applied for the extension?" I asked, pulling out a legal pad and pen. I wanted to hear their version of the conversation I'd had with my lending team just days earlier, when my loan officers had recommended proceeding with foreclosure, citing the family's debt-to-income ratio and the declining profitability of small dairy operations. I'd instructed them to give the Mitchells additional time to explore their options. I hadn't revealed my connection, of course. I'd simply marked their file for executive review and delayed the proceedings. "They said our business model wasn't sustainable," my mother replied, anger creeping into her voice. "Some young loan officer who probably never set foot on a farm told us that dairy farming was economically obsolete and that they couldn't justify the risk." 25 years we've been banking with them, Sarah. 25 years of on-time payments until this rough patch, and they won't even consider our history. I wrote down notes I didn't need, buying time to process the surreal situation. My own employees, following standard banking protocols I'd established, had dismissed my parents' loan application. They'd done exactly what any responsible financial institution would do when faced with a high-risk agricultural loan. The fact that the borrowers were my parents was irrelevant to the business decision, but it created a personal complexity I'd never anticipated when I'd started Cornerstone 15 years ago. "Have you considered selling part of the land?" I asked, though I knew from their file that they'd already explored this option. The real estate market for agricultural property in their area had been depressed for years, and the remaining valuable parcels were already mortgaged. "We tried," my father said, shaking his head. "The good pasture land is already collateral for the existing loans. What's left is either too rocky for cultivation or too close to the old chemical runoff area to be marketable. We're stuck, Sarah. This is our last hope." They sat there in my office, 2 proud people in their 60s who had spent their entire adult lives building something meaningful, now reduced to asking their daughter for help they couldn't afford to repay. The daughter they'd never quite understood, whose military service they'd tolerated rather than celebrated, whose business success they'd never bothered to investigate or acknowledge. I thought about the conversation I'd had with my chief lending officer just that morning. Janet Rodriguez had presented the Mitchell case as a straightforward business decision. The numbers didn't work, the industry was in decline, and the bank's shareholders expected responsible risk management. She'd recommended proceeding with foreclosure and had already prepared the paperwork for final processing. I'd asked her to hold off for another week, citing a need for additional executive review. Janet had looked puzzled, but hadn't questioned my judgment. "I need to think about this," I told my parents, closing the legal pad and setting down my pen. $200,000 isn't pocket change, and I need to understand all the implications before I commit to anything. This was true, though not for the reasons they assumed. I could write them a personal check for twice that amount without affecting my monthly budget, but the real complexity lay in the intersection of my business and family relationships. My mother reached across the desk and touched my hand, her fingers cold despite the warm September afternoon. "Sarah, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye. I know we didn't understand your choices, your need to serve in the military, your focus on business instead of family. But you're the only person we have left to ask. Our other children. Robert Jr. is struggling with his own mortgage after the divorce, and Jennifer's teacher salary barely covers her student loans. The mention of my siblings stung slightly. Robert Jr., the golden child who'd followed Dad into agricultural management, but had failed spectacularly at his own farm operation. Jennifer, the family favorite who'd become an elementary school teacher as my parents had always hoped one of. Their children would choose a noble profession. Both of them had received enthusiastic support and financial backing from our parents over the years. Both of them were now unable to help in return. "I understand," I said softly. "And I appreciate that you came to me. It means more than you know that you trust me with this." I stood up from my chair, straightening my charcoal gray suit jacket. The tailored outfit had cost more than most people spent on clothing in a year, but my parents saw it simply as appropriate business attire. They had no context for understanding the level of success it represented. "Can you give me a few days to review your financial documents and explore some options?" I asked, walking around the desk to where they sat. "I want to make sure that if I do help, it's in a way that actually solves the problem long term, not just kicks it down the road." My father stood as well, extending his hand in the formal gesture that had defined our relationship since I'd returned from Afghanistan. No hugs, no emotional displays, just the respectful handshake between adults who happen to share DNA. "We appreciate anything you can do, Sarah. We know it's asking a lot." As I shook his hand, I noticed the calluses from decades of farm work. The same hands that had taught me to drive a tractor when I was 12, before our relationship had become complicated by my unconventional choices. These were the hands of a man who had built something lasting and meaningful, who deserved better than to lose it all because of circumstances beyond his control. After they left, I stood at my office window watching the afternoon traffic crawl through downtown Chicago. In a few hours, I would drive home to my lakefront penthouse, pour a glass of wine worth more than my parents spent on groceries in a month, and try to figure out how to navigate the most complex situation of my professional and personal life. My parents needed $200,000 to save their family farm. I could provide that amount without blinking. But they were asking Sarah Mitchell, the daughter they'd barely supported, not knowing they were actually asking Sarah Mitchell, the CEO and majority owner of the bank that held their fate in its hands. The next few days would determine not just the future of Mitchell Family Dairy, but the future of relationships that had been strained for far too long. The leather-bound financial portfolio sat unopened on my dining room table as I poured my second glass of Bordeaux, the weight of my parents' situation settling over me like the Chicago fog rolling in from Lake Michigan. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, the city lights twinkled 43 floors below, a reminder of how far I'd climbed from the girl who used to milk cows at dawn before catching the school bus. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. "Mrs. Rodriguez needs to discuss the Mitchell foreclosure first thing Monday. Says it's time-sensitive." Janet had no idea she was discussing my parents' fate, treating it as just another file in her stack of problem loans. I set the phone aside and finally opened the portfolio my parents had left behind, documents I'd reviewed countless times in my professional capacity, but never through the lens of a daughter watching her family's legacy crumble. The numbers told a story of gradual decline, masked by stubborn pride. Mitchell Family Dairy had been profitable for decades, weathering recessions and market fluctuations through careful management and diversification. But the past 3 years had been brutal. Climate change had brought unprecedented weather patterns to Illinois farmland, alternating between devastating droughts and flooding that destroyed crops and contaminated feed supplies. The detailed expense reports showed my father's desperate attempts to modernize equipment, investing in technology he couldn't afford in hopes of improving efficiency. What struck me most was discovering they'd already approached 7 different financial institutions before coming to me. First National, where they'd banked for 15 years before Cornerstone, had turned them down flat. Midwest Agricultural Credit had offered them a loan with interest rates so predatory it would have guaranteed bankruptcy within 2 years. Even the Farm Credit Union, traditionally sympathetic to agricultural operations, had declined their application, citing systemic industry challenges. I walked to my home office, a space decorated with military memorabilia my parents had never bothered to examine during their rare visits. My Bronze Star sat in a place of honor next to photographs from Afghanistan, images of the financial literacy programs I'd established for soldiers preparing to transition to civilian life. Those programs had sparked my passion for banking and finance, seeing how proper financial planning could transform lives devastated by war and uncertainty. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent years helping strangers achieve financial stability while my own parents struggled in silence. But then again, they'd never asked for help before, never indicated they saw me as someone capable of providing solutions. To them, I was still the rebellious daughter who'd chosen combat boots over wedding shoes, business suits over aprons. My laptop chimed with an encrypted email from Marcus Webb, my chief financial officer, who was working late from his home office as usual. Sarah, the quarterly board meeting is next week. The Mitchell Dairy foreclosure is on the agenda as part of our risk management review. Board members are particularly interested in our agricultural lending policies given recent industry volatility. Need to know if you want me to present standard recommendations, or if there are any special considerations. Marcus had been with Cornerstone since our third year of operation, recruited from Goldman Sachs with promises of equity participation and the chance to build something meaningful in the Midwest. He was brilliant, analytical, and completely unaware that our CEO had any personal connection to the farming family facing foreclosure. In his mind, the Mitchell case was simply data points on a spreadsheet, risk ratios and profit projections that pointed toward one logical conclusion. I closed the laptop without responding and returned to the dining room, spreading the financial documents across the mahogany table. My parents' tax returns for the past 5 years painted a picture of resilience in the face of mounting challenges. They'd consistently reinvested profits back into the operation, maintaining equipment and facilities even as margins tightened. The veterinary bills alone told a story of commitment to animal welfare that went beyond mere compliance with regulations. What my father hadn't mentioned during our meeting was the consulting work he'd been doing for other dairy farmers, sharing decades of expertise to help neighbors improve their operations. The income was modest but consistent, demonstrating his reputation and skill within the agricultural community. My mother had expanded their farmers' market presence, developing a loyal customer base for their organic milk and artisanal cheeses. These weren't failed entrepreneurs seeking a bailout. These were innovative business owners adapting to changing market conditions. The medical bills from my mother's surgery were staggering. What had started as routine gallbladder removal had become complicated by infections and extended recovery time. Even with insurance, the out-of-pocket expenses had consumed their emergency fund and forced them to defer equipment maintenance that ultimately led to costly breakdowns during their busiest season. I found myself making notes in the margins, the same way I analyzed investment opportunities for the bank's commercial lending division. But this wasn't just another business case study. This was my family's survival, their dignity, their legacy. Every number represented sleepless nights, difficult decisions, and the gradual erosion of confidence that had brought them to my office. My wine glass was empty, but I was too restless to sit still. I walked to the window wall overlooking the lake, watching late-night joggers follow the shoreline path 43 floors below. Some of them were probably Cornerstone employees heading home after long days managing other people's financial crises, completely unaware that their CEO was wrestling with the most personal professional dilemma of her career. The phone rang, interrupting my brooding. The caller ID showed my brother's number, and I briefly considered letting it go to voicemail. Robert Jr. and I hadn't spoken since Christmas, when he'd made another disparaging comment about people who make money moving money around, instead of creating something tangible. He'd been bitter ever since his own farm had failed, blaming market conditions and bad luck rather than acknowledging his poor financial planning and resistance to modernization. "Sarah, thank God you answered." His voice sounded strained, exhausted. Mom called and told me about their meeting with you today. I wanted to reach out before you make any decisions. I waited for the inevitable request for money, the same pattern that had repeated throughout our adult relationship. Robert Jr. asking for help, making promises about repayment that we both knew were unrealistic, then avoiding family gatherings when the loans went unpaid. I know what you're thinking, he continued, surprising me with his directness. You think I'm calling to ask for money for myself, but I'm not. I'm calling because I know what losing that farm would do to Dad. It would kill him, Sarah, literally. His identity, his purpose, his connection to Grandpa's legacy, it's all tied up in that land. The admission caught me off guard. Robert Jr. rarely showed emotional vulnerability, preferring to maintain the stoic facade he'd inherited from our father. Hearing him acknowledge the depth of our parents' attachment to the farm reminded me why their situation was about more than just financial numbers. I've been thinking about it all evening, I said, surprising myself by engaging in honest conversation with my brother. It's a significant amount of money, and I need to understand all the implications before I commit to anything. Sarah, I know we haven't always gotten along. I know I've been jealous of your success, resentful that you made something of yourself, while I couldn't make the farm work. But whatever differences we have, this is bigger than our personal issues. This is about family. I could hear voices in the background, probably his ex-wife dropping off their daughter for his weekend custody time. The divorce had been ugly and expensive, another reminder of how financial stress could destroy relationships and futures. Have you looked at their books recently? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Do you think the operation is viable long-term, or are we just postponing the inevitable? Robert Jr. was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost hear him thinking through the implications of honest assessment versus family loyalty. The dairy industry is tough right now, but Dad's operation is sound. The organic certification opens up premium markets that most conventional dairies can't access. Mom's direct marketing efforts have built real customer relationships that create stability. If they can get past this rough patch, I think they have a chance. His analysis aligned with my own professional assessment, but hearing it from someone who understood farming added credibility to my instincts. Robert Jr. might have failed at running his own operation, but he understood agriculture in ways I never would despite my business expertise. There's something else, he continued, his voice dropping lower. Dad's been talking about retirement planning lately. Not giving up the farm, but transitioning some of the day-to-day operations to hired management. He's 64, Sarah. This might be his last chance to secure the farm's future and his own retirement. The revelation added another layer to consider. If my parents could stabilize their finances and develop a succession plan, the farm might continue operating for another generation. But without intervention, they would lose everything and face retirement with nothing but Social Security income. After ending the call with Robert Jr., I returned to the financial documents with fresh perspective. This wasn't just about saving the family farm. It was about honoring the work ethic and entrepreneurial spirit that had shaped all of us, even if we'd expressed it in different ways. My grandfather had started with nothing after returning from Korea, building a sustainable business through decades of careful planning and hard work. My parents had continued that legacy, adapting to changing markets and regulations while maintaining their commitment to quality and community. I thought about the soldiers I'd served with in Afghanistan, men and women who'd risked everything to protect strangers they'd never meet. My parents had spent their lives feeding families throughout the Midwest, providing wholesome products while caring for their land and animals with genuine dedication. Both forms of service deserved respect and support. The wine bottle was empty, but my mind was clear. I had the resources to help my parents save their farm, but I also had responsibilities to my bank's shareholders, employees, and other customers. The challenge was finding a solution that honored both obligations while potentially healing relationships that had been strained for years. I gathered the financial documents into neat stacks, making mental notes about additional information I needed before making any decisions. Tomorrow I would begin the careful process of exploring options that might save Mitchell Family Dairy without compromising Cornerstone Financial's integrity or my own professional reputation. The complexity of the situation was daunting, but I'd faced worse challenges in both military service and business leadership. This time, however, the stakes were deeply personal, and failure would mean losing more than just money. Monday morning arrived with the sharp clarity that comes after sleepless nights spent wrestling with impossible decisions. I sat in my office at dawn, watching the sun rise over Lake Michigan while reviewing the Mitchell file one final time before my 8 o'clock meeting with Janet Rodriguez. My chief lending officer had scheduled what she assumed would be a routine discussion about foreclosure procedures, completely unaware that she was about to discuss my parents' fate with their own daughter. The 20-minute drive from my penthouse to Cornerstone's headquarters had given me time to compartmentalize, to separate Sarah Mitchell, the daughter, from Sarah Mitchell, the CEO. But as I stared at the formal foreclosure documents Janet had prepared, the professional boundaries I'd spent 15 years constructing felt paper-thin. Janet knocked and entered, without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through years of exemplary service and the kind of professional relationship built on mutual respect and shared success. She carried her signature leather portfolio and wore the expression of someone prepared to discuss unpleasant but necessary business decisions. "The Mitchell Dairy situation is straightforward," she began, settling into the chair across from my desk with practiced efficiency. $200,000 in arrears, declining revenue trajectory, industry-wide challenges that suggest continued volatility. Our risk assessment models indicate a 73% probability of default even with loan modification. She opened her portfolio and extracted a comprehensive analysis that reduced my parents' lives to actuarial projections and market trends. "Walk me through the family's banking history," I said, though I already knew every detail. Professional. Curiosity was expected, and I needed to hear Janet's perspective on borrowers she saw only as numbers in a database. 25-year relationship with solid payment history until 18 months ago, Janet replied, consulting her notes. Robert and Margaret Mitchell, both in their mid-60s, second-generation dairy farmers operating on inherited land. The financial stress appears to be related to external factors rather than management incompetence, but that doesn't change the fundamental risk equation. I nodded thoughtfully, maintaining the neutral expression I'd perfected during countless similar conversations. "What's your assessment of their character and business acumen?" Janet paused, clearly wondering why I was requesting subjective evaluation of borrowers we'd already decided to foreclose on. "Honestly, they seem like decent people caught in a bad situation. Robert Mitchell has an excellent reputation in the agricultural community, and their customer loyalty is impressive for such a small operation. But decent people still default on loans when the numbers don't work. Have they explored all available options for refinancing or restructuring?" I asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear Janet's analysis of the broader financial landscape my parents had been navigating. "They've been turned down by every major agricultural lender in the region," Janet confirmed. "First National cited industry instability. Midwest Ag offered terms that would have guaranteed bankruptcy within 2 years. Even the farm credit unions are tightening requirements given recent defaults in the sector." She flipped through several pages of documentation. "They're running out of time and options, which is why they've apparently approached family members for private financing." The mention of family involvement made my stomach tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. "Family members with sufficient resources to handle a $200,000 agricultural loan?" "According to our preliminary background checks, they have a daughter who works in financial services here in Chicago," Janet said, consulting her notes. "Sarah Mitchell, military veteran, Northwestern MBA, currently employed in the banking sector. Our research suggests she might have sufficient personal resources, though agricultural loans are notoriously risky for private investors. I almost smiled at the irony of Janet researching my own financial capacity to help my parents, completely unaware she was briefing me on myself. The background check had probably taken her researchers 15 minutes to determine that Sarah Mitchell, the daughter, was indeed capable of providing the requested assistance, not knowing that Sarah Mitchell, the daughter, was also Sarah Mitchell, the CEO, sitting across from her. "What's your recommendation regarding timeline?" I asked, shifting the conversation toward procedural matters while I processed the strange experience of hearing my professional life discussed as if I were a stranger. "Standard foreclosure procedures. Suggest we should initiate formal proceedings by the end of the week," Janet replied. "The family has requested additional time to explore private financing options, but we can't indefinitely delay collection efforts based on vague possibilities. Our shareholders expect responsible risk management, and the Mitchell case will likely be cited as an example during the quarterly board review." The mention of the board review reminded me that my decision would need to withstand scrutiny from directors who had entrusted me with fiduciary responsibility for the bank's assets. Board members like Harrison Crawford, the retired steel executive who had invested heavily in Cornerstone during our expansion phase, would expect data-driven decisions uncompromised by sentiment or personal considerations. "Schedule a follow-up. Meeting for Thursday," I said, buying myself 3 additional days to develop a strategy that could satisfy both personal and professional obligations. "I want to review some alternative approaches before we proceed with foreclosure." Janet looked surprised but nodded professionally. "Alternative approaches? We've already explored loan modification and restructuring options. The numbers simply don't support continued lending to this borrower." "Sometimes the numbers tell only part of the story," I said carefully. "I want to examine whether there might be creative solutions that serve both the bank's interests and the community's needs." The explanation was deliberately vague, but not unreasonable given my reputation for innovative financial strategies. After Janet left, I sat alone with the weight of decisions that could reshape multiple lives. My parents needed money they couldn't obtain through conventional channels. I had the resources to help them, both personally and through the bank I controlled. But any solution would need to navigate complex ethical boundaries while maintaining the professional reputation I'd spent years building. The intercom buzzed with a call from Marcus Webb, who wanted to discuss quarterly projections and the upcoming board presentation. "Sarah, I've been reviewing our agricultural lending portfolio in preparation for the board meeting. The Mitchell Dairy case is interesting because it represents exactly the kind of community banking relationship that differentiated us from larger competitors when we started." Marcus had unknowingly identified the strategic tension at the heart of my dilemma. Cornerstone had been built on the principle of supporting local businesses and families overlooked by major banks. We'd succeeded by taking calculated risks on borrowers who needed more than just favorable interest rates, who needed partners willing to understand their unique circumstances and long-term potential. "Explain what you mean," I said, genuinely, curious about his perspective on the case that had consumed my thoughts for days. Traditional risk models focus on short-term cash flow and industry trends, but they miss intangible assets like community reputation, customer loyalty, and operational expertise, Marcus continued. "The Mitchell family has been farming successfully for decades. They're facing temporary challenges related to external factors, not fundamental business problems. In our early days, we would have found creative ways to support borrowers like this." His analysis aligned perfectly with my own instincts, but hearing it from my CFO added professional validation to what might otherwise seem like emotional decision-making. Marcus was suggesting that helping my parents might actually be good business, not just good family relations. "What kind of creative solutions are you thinking about?" I asked, testing whether he might independently develop strategies I was considering. "Graduated. Payment schedules tied to seasonal revenue patterns, partial conversion to equity participation in land appreciation, maybe even exploring agricultural tax credits that could improve the overall return profile, Marcus suggested. We could structure something that acknowledges the cyclical nature of farming while protecting the bank's interests. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Marcus outlining sophisticated financial instruments that could transform my parents' crisis into an opportunity for innovative community banking. By the time we finished, I had the framework for a solution that could save Mitchell Family Dairy while demonstrating Cornerstone's commitment to creative problem-solving. But implementing such a solution would require revealing information I'd kept secret for 15 years, potentially transforming family relationships that had been defined by misunderstanding and distance. The professional opportunity came with profound personal risks that went far beyond financial considerations. I spent the remainder of the morning researching agricultural lending innovations, consulting with industry experts, and developing preliminary proposals that could work for both my parents and my bank. By lunchtime, I had identified 3 viable approaches that could provide the help my family needed while maintaining my professional integrity. The challenge now was deciding whether I was ready to bridge the gap between the daughter they'd never fully understood and the CEO they'd never known existed. The call came at 11:30 that Tuesday night, just as I was reviewing agricultural loan structures for the 3rd time that week. My mother's voice was strained, barely recognizable through what sounded like tears she was trying not to shed. "Sarah, I'm sorry to call so late, but we just got another letter from the bank." Her words came in rushed bursts, as if speaking quickly might somehow minimize the impact of what she had to say. "They're accelerating the timeline. We have 2 weeks now, not 30 days. 2 weeks to come up with everything or lose the farm." I set down my wine glass and walked to the window, my reflection ghost-like against the Chicago skyline. "What exactly does the letter say, Mom?" "Something about non-compliance with interim payment requirements. We missed a deadline we didn't even know existed." Her voice cracked completely now, and I could hear my father's muffled voice in the background, probably trying to comfort her while wrestling with his own panic. "Robert's been making calls all evening, but it's after business hours, and nobody's available to explain what happened. The interim payment requirement was a standard clause in agricultural loans designed to demonstrate borrower commitment during extended review periods. My parents had probably missed a notification buried in legal language they didn't fully understand, triggering automatic acceleration of the foreclosure timeline. It was a technicality that happened frequently in distressed loan situations, usually because borrowers were too overwhelmed to navigate the complex procedural requirements. "Mom, slow down and tell me exactly what you need from me," I said, though I already knew the answer. They needed their daughter to provide a solution that would save not just their farm, but their dignity and sense of self-worth. They needed help from someone they'd never fully believed in, someone whose success they'd never bothered to understand or acknowledge. "We need to know if you can help us with the loan," she said directly, abandoning the careful politeness that had characterized our relationship for years. "Not just part of it, all of it. $200,000 by next Friday, or we lose everything your grandfather built." The desperation in her voice was heartbreaking, but it was also revealing. For the first time in my adult life, my mother was speaking to me as an equal, someone whose capabilities she finally respected enough to ask for real help. The crisis had stripped away the patronizing tone she'd used when discussing my career, replacing it with the raw honesty that comes when people have nothing left to lose. "I need to see the accelerated notice before I can give you a definitive answer," I said, buying time to process the information while maintaining professional composure. "Can you bring it to my office tomorrow afternoon?" "Of course. Yes, we'll drive down immediately," she replied, relief flooding her voice at the possibility of action, even if the outcome remained uncertain. "Sarah, I know we haven't always understood your choices, but right now you're the only hope we have left." After ending the call, I sat in my darkened living room considering the implications of the accelerated timeline. 2 weeks meant no opportunity for complex financial restructuring or creative loan modifications. My parents needed immediate cash, in an amount that would be significant for most people, but represented less than 1% of my personal net worth. The solution was simple from a financial perspective, but complicated by layers of family history and professional considerations. Called Marcus Webb's direct line, knowing he would still be awake reviewing projections for the quarterly board meeting. "Marcus, I need you to pull the Mitchell Dairy file and review the acceleration notice that was sent out today." "The Mitchell file?" "Sarah, it's almost midnight. Is this related to the board presentation?" His voice carried the patient confusion of someone accustomed to working with an occasionally obsessive CEO, but surprised by the urgency around what he considered a routine foreclosure case. "I'm exploring some alternative approaches that might be worth presenting to the board as examples of community banking innovation," I said, which was technically true even if it omitted the personal motivations driving my sudden interest. "I need to understand all the procedural requirements and deadlines before I can develop a comprehensive proposal." Marcus agreed to have the complete file delivered to my office by 8 the next morning, along with a summary of comparable cases, where we'd successfully restructured distressed agricultural loans. His efficiency and expertise had been crucial to Cornerstone's success, and now I was depending on his skills to help navigate the most personally significant financial crisis of my career. I spent the remainder of the night researching my own bank's policies and procedures, looking for precedents that might support unconventional approaches to the Mitchell situation. What I discovered was both encouraging and frustrating. Cornerstone had indeed made exceptions for borrowers facing temporary hardship, but always within established risk parameters that my parents' situation didn't meet. The next morning arrived, gray and cold, typical October weather that matched my mood as I prepared for a day of difficult conversations and complex decisions. I dressed carefully in a navy suit that projected authority without arrogance, knowing that my appearance would influence how both my staff and my parents perceived the discussions ahead. The Mitchell file was waiting on my desk when I arrived, thick with documentation that told the story of my parents' financial decline in meticulous detail. Janet Rodriguez had included a personal note suggesting that we expedite foreclosure proceedings to avoid further complications, completely unaware that her recommendation would destroy my family's legacy. Marcus knocked and entered at precisely 9 o'clock, carrying additional research materials and wearing the focused expression he reserved for complex problem-solving sessions. "I've reviewed the Mitchell case in detail, and I think there might be some interesting possibilities for innovative structuring." "Walk me through your analysis," I said, settling back in my chair to hear my CFO's assessment of solutions that could save my parents' farm. "The fundamental issue is cash flow timing rather than underlying asset value," Marcus began, spreading financial projections across my desk. "The dairy operation generates sufficient revenue to service debt obligations, but the seasonal nature of agricultural income creates temporary gaps that traditional banking models don't handle well." He outlined a sophisticated approach involving graduated payment schedules, seasonal adjustment mechanisms, and partial equity participation that would transform my parents' debt burden into a manageable long-term relationship. The proposal was financially sound and potentially profitable for the bank, but it would require board approval and comprehensive documentation that might take weeks to complete. "How quickly could we implement something like this?" I asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. 6 to 8 weeks for full implementation," Marcus replied. "We'd need board approval, regulatory review, and complete restructuring of the existing loan documents. It's definitely possible, but not within the current foreclosure timeline." The gap between what was possible and what was necessary crystallized the central challenge I faced. My parents needed immediate help that couldn't be provided through conventional banking channels, even innovative ones. The only solution that could work within their timeline was direct personal intervention, which would require revealing the truth about my success and potentially transforming family relationships that had been defined by distance and misunderstanding. For decades. Let me ask you a hypothetical question, I said carefully. If a bank executive had personal knowledge of a borrower's character and long-term prospects, knowledge that wasn't reflected in standard credit analysis, would that information be relevant to lending decisions? Marcus considered the question thoughtfully, probably wondering why I was exploring theoretical scenarios during a discussion of specific business cases. Personal knowledge could certainly inform risk assessment, as long as the decision-making process remained objective and properly documented. Why do you ask? I'm thinking about the Mitchell case specifically, I said, testing the boundaries of what I could reveal without compromising my position. What if someone with intimate knowledge of their operation could provide guarantees or additional security that wasn't apparent in their financial statements? That would change the entire risk profile, Marcus said immediately. Agricultural lending often involves intangible factors that don't show up in traditional analysis. Local knowledge, family reputation, community connections, these can be significant factors in long-term success. Our conversation was interrupted by my assistant announcing that my parents had arrived for their afternoon appointment. I felt a familiar tension in my shoulders as I prepared for the most complex conversation of my professional life, one that would require balancing multiple roles simultaneously. Should I stay for this meeting? Marcus asked, gathering his materials. No, this is something I need to handle personally, I replied, which was perhaps the most honest statement I'd made all week. As Marcus left my office, I took a deep breath and prepared to face my parents with information that would change everything. We thought we knew about each other. The accelerated foreclosure notice had forced a decision I'd been avoiding for years, bringing us to a moment of truth that would determine not just the fate of Mitchell Family Dairy, but the future of relationships that had been strained by misunderstanding and missed opportunities. In a few minutes, I would need to decide whether to reveal 15 years of carefully guarded secrets, transforming myself from the daughter they'd never quite understood into the CEO they'd never known existed. The conversation ahead would determine whether this crisis became the catalyst for genuine family reconciliation or simply another chapter in our long history of missed connections. My parents entered my office with the weighted posture of people carrying more than they could bear. My father clutched a manila envelope against his chest like armor, while my mother's usually perfect composure showed cracks around the edges. They moved with the careful deliberation of individuals who understood that the next hour would determine whether they kept their life's work or lost everything. "Sarah, we can't thank you enough for seeing us again so quickly," my father said, settling into the chair across from my desk with visible effort. The stress of the past few days had aged him noticeably, adding lines around his eyes and a tremor to his hands that I'd never seen before. I gestured for them to sit, maintaining the professional demeanor that had served me well in countless difficult conversations, though none had carried the personal weight of this moment. "Tell me about the accelerated notice you received." My mother opened the envelope with shaking fingers, extracting a document bearing Cornerstone Financial's letterhead. Seeing my own bank's logo on papers that were causing my parents such anguish created a surreal disconnect between my professional and personal identities. The notice was standard legal language, professionally written and properly formatted, but devastating in its implications for the people who had raised me. "We missed an interim payment deadline we didn't know existed," my father explained, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "Apparently there was a clause requiring us to demonstrate progress toward resolving the loan within 10 business days of our initial extension request. We thought we were supposed to wait for their decision, but they were waiting for us to take action." I read through the acceleration notice, recognizing the precise legal language my own attorneys had crafted to protect the bank's interests in complex foreclosure situations. Every clause was designed to ensure prompt resolution while providing borrowers with fair opportunity to address their obligations. In theory, it was protective of both parties. In practice, it was incomprehensible to people already overwhelmed by financial stress. "The letter gives us until next Friday to satisfy the full debt obligation," my mother added, her voice barely steady. $200,000 in cash, or they take everything. The house, the land, the equipment, even the livestock. As I studied the document, I made a decision that had been building for days. The time for careful consideration and professional distance had passed. My parents needed help that only I could provide, and continuing to maintain the separation between my family relationships and my business success served no one's interests. Mom, Dad, before we discuss solutions, there's something I need to tell you about my situation, I began, setting the acceleration notice aside and looking directly at both of them. Something I should have explained years ago, but the timing never seemed right. They looked at me with expressions of polite attention mixed with desperate hope, probably expecting me to outline the terms under which I might be able to help them secure private financing. They had no context for understanding that their daughter possessed not just the ability to provide a personal loan, but the authority to cancel their debt entirely. The reason I'm confident I can help you isn't just because I've been successful in financial services, I continued, choosing my words carefully. It's because I'm in a position to address this situation directly through channels you might not expect. My father frowned slightly, clearly confused by my indirect approach to what he assumed would be a straightforward discussion of loan terms and repayment schedules. Sarah, we appreciate whatever you can do to help, but we need to be realistic about amounts and timelines. $200,000 is a significant sum, even for someone with your expertise. I stood up from my desk and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline while gathering courage for the revelation that would change everything between us. 15 years of carefully maintained separation between my professional achievements and family relationships was about to collapse in a single conversation. The bank that holds your mortgage, Cornerstone Financial Services, is the institution I founded after leaving the military 15 years ago, I said, turning back to face them. I'm not just an employee in the banking sector. I'm the CEO and majority owner of the bank that's foreclosing on your farm. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's face went completely blank, as if her mind was refusing to process information that contradicted everything she thought she knew about her daughter. My father stared at me with an expression that cycled through confusion, disbelief, and slowly dawning comprehension. That's impossible, my mother whispered finally. Cornerstone Financial is one of the largest regional banks in the Midwest. You work for a bank, you don't own one. I walked to my desk and retrieved a framed photograph that usually sat facing away from visitors, turning it around so they could see the image of me cutting the ribbon at Cornerstone's headquarters opening. 5 years earlier, standing beside me in the photograph were the mayor of Chicago, the state banking commissioner, and several board members whose names they would recognize from business news coverage. I started Cornerstone with capital I'd accumulated through early investments in financial technology, I explained, sitting back down and speaking with the calm precision I used for board presentations. The military taught me discipline and leadership, but Afghanistan showed me how financial stability could transform lives. I wanted to build something that would serve communities overlooked by larger institutions. My father picked up the photograph, with trembling hands, studying it as if it were evidence in a court case rather than a family memento. You own the bank that's foreclosing on us? I control the bank, yes, I confirmed. Which means I also control the decision about what happens to your loan. The implications began settling over them like a slow-moving storm. My mother looked around my office with new understanding, seeing the expensive furnishings and original artwork not as the trappings of a successful employee, but as the possessions of someone whose wealth exceeded anything she'd imagined. How long? My father asked, his voice barely audible. How long have you been letting us struggle while you had the power to help? The question I'd been dreading cut straight to the heart of my ethical dilemma. For months, I'd known about their financial difficulties through my bank's loan review process. I'd watched their situation deteriorate while maintaining professional distance, telling myself that mixing family relationships with business decisions would compromise my integrity. I learned about your specific situation 3 weeks ago, when Your file came across my desk for executive review, I said honestly. But I've been successful enough to help you for years. I just never thought you'd want my help, or that you'd see me as someone capable of providing it. My mother stood up abruptly, pacing to the window with agitated energy that reflected the magnitude of her emotional processing. You let us come here begging for help when you could have solved our problems with a phone call? It's not that simple, I replied, though I knew the explanation would sound inadequate. Mixing personal relationships with business decisions creates conflicts of interest that could damage both the bank and our family. I needed to find a solution that served everyone's interests ethically. Ethics? My father's voice rose for the first time since they'd arrived. You're talking about ethics while we're facing the loss of everything our family built? The anger was understandable, even justified, but it also provided an opening to explain the broader context of my position. Dad, I have responsibilities to shareholders, employees, and thousands of other customers. I can't make arbitrary decisions based on personal relationships without compromising the institution's integrity. But you can make a decision, my mother said, turning back from the window with desperate hope replacing anger. You can save the farm. Yes, I said simply. I can save the farm. What followed was the most complex negotiation of my life, not because the financial terms were complicated, but because every element involved untangling 15 years of misunderstanding and missed communication. We spent 2 hours working through not just the immediate crisis, but the longer-term implications of our changed relationship. I proposed converting their debt into a long-term partnership that would allow them to maintain ownership and control of Mitchell Family Dairy, while providing Cornerstone with agricultural investment returns tied to the farm's success. The structure would satisfy regulatory requirements, protect the bank's interests, and give my parents the stability they needed to plan for eventual retirement. So the foreclosure is canceled? My mother asked as we concluded our discussion. The foreclosure never existed, I said. I delayed the proceedings when I realized who the borrowers were. You were never in real danger of losing the farm, though you didn't know that. As they prepared to leave, my father paused at the door. Sarah, I need to ask you something directly. Are you angry with us? For not believing in you? For not understanding what you were building? I considered the question carefully, thinking about years of family gatherings where my achievements were dismissed or ignored, conversations where my military service was minimized, and my business success was misunderstood. I'm not angry anymore. Dad, I said truthfully. I'm grateful that this crisis gave us a chance to finally see each other clearly. 6 months later, Mitchell Family Dairy was thriving under the new partnership structure. My parents had expanded their organic certification and direct marketing efforts, while Cornerstone's agricultural lending division had become a model for innovative community banking that other institutions were studying and replicating. The Kai family relationships that had been strained by misunderstanding for decades had been transformed by honesty and mutual respect. My success was no longer a mystery they couldn't comprehend, and their commitment to meaningful work was no longer something I took for granted. Sometimes the most profound victories aren't about proving others wrong, but about finding ways to prove everyone right. My parents weren't wrong to value hard work and community contribution. I wasn't wrong to pursue unconventional paths that led to unexpected success. We were just wrong to assume we couldn't understand and support each other's choices. If you've listened to my story, I want to hear from you. Subscribe and tell me in the comments about a time when family crisis led to deeper understanding. Sometimes our greatest challenges become opportunities to bridge gaps we didn't even know existed, transforming relationships in ways we never imagined possible.